Welcome everyone to this evening's event, a discussion of the new book, The First, the Few, the Only, How Women of Color Can Redefine Power in Corporate America. I'm Ellen Janpole, business librarian at the New Haven Free Public Library, and we are presenting this program this evening in partnership with the Westport Library and the Women's Business Development Council. Our sponsor from Westport is Jennifer Keller, Marketing and Events and Programming Coordinator at the Westport Library. She is having some audio problems tonight, so I'm taking over for this part. I am excited tonight to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Many of you know Fran Pastore as the founder and CEO of the Women's Business Development Council in Connecticut. She has also served as a member of the National Women's Business Council and the U.S. Small Business Administration. She has been on the board of Women Impacting Public Policy and the Global Advisory Board for the Akala Institute for Women in Kigali, Rwanda. Ms. Pastore served on Governor Lamont's transition team as co-chair of the Jobs and Economy Policy Committee and has served as chair of the Governor's Workforce Council's BIPOC Committee. Currently, Ms. Pastore serves as chair of the Connecticut Paid Leave Authority and is a member of the Governor's Economic Advisory Council. Deepa Purushothaman is the co-founder of Nformation, which provides safe new space for professional women of color and serves as a woman and public policy program leader in practice at the Harvard's Kennedy School. Prior to this, Deepa worked at Deloitte and was the first Indian American woman to make partner in the company's history. She was also Deloitte's National Women's Initiative leader in the firm's renowned program to recruit, retain, and advance women. She has degrees from Wellesley College, Harvard's Kennedy School, and the London School of Economics. She has been featured at national conferences and in publications including Bloomberg, Business Week, and the Harvard Business Review. We welcome both Fran and Deepa, and I will turn the program over to them. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. And hello, Deepa, again.
Hello.
It's so good to see you again. I'm going to jump right into this because of the day that today is.
Okay.
We're going to jump right into it and talk about that, and we'll get to the other pieces that we planned on talking about later. What a momentous day in the history of our country. I have chills. What an incredible day for Black women and women of color. The first ever candidate for the Supreme Court is an African-American woman. I'm just so elated. What do you think she is thinking today after sitting there? After sitting there in Congress and, per your earlier comments, literally just sitting there and listening. What is going through her mind? This highly educated, incredibly brilliant and accomplished woman.
You know, I wish we had that, because I feel like it would be a guidebook for so many of us, right, on what to do in situations, obviously not exactly like that, but situations where you're uncomfortable, you're having to really keep your composure. And, you know, in a lot of moments, I'm guessing she's boiling inside, right? So there were moments where, you know, she talked about her daughters, and she talked, I didn't get to watch a lot of it because you and I were just chatting. We had busy days, but I got to see snippets talking about her daughters, like really exciting, momentous moments, right? Talking about her parents and their history, and, you know, some of the people interviewing or talking about her, because I don't even feel she got interviewed today, right? It was more the setup for what's coming for the rest of the week.
Exactly.
It was discussions of her lived experience and just how it's so monumental and it's so different. And she represents so many things. But I have to be honest, I couldn't help but watch her face during a lot of the challenging moments, right? Where not her credentials would be in question, but just who she was and what she was and talking about the process. And it was this, I don't want to call it odd because that feels wrong. Like I don't know her well enough to call it odd, but it just seemed like this really uncomfortable smile, maybe, where you're having to sit there and realize you're going to be sitting through a lot that is not about you and has nothing to do, about you. And, we were briefly talking, Fran, like the interesting thing is, so much of what she's going to be evaluated on has nothing to do with her qualifications for the role. And so many of the women of color I interviewed over 500 women of color in writing this book. I think it's similar, right? There's so much outside of the scope of what you were hired to do that is part of the job. And so, yeah, I just couldn't help but thinking. And I also thought back to Vice President Kamala Harris when she was in the vice presidential debates. And there was that whole, I'm speaking, I actually did a TEDx talk about it, about what she must have done to practice that I'm speaking and smile and be stern, but not smile too much and not be, aggressive or seen as, too angry and all of that. It's like a whole extra layer of what she was rehearsing and what she had to do. So that's all I was thinking was I would love if she could write out, her thoughts or, if she could text that. I just think it would be a playbook in what to do in situations that are uncomfortable.
Absolutely. I mean, it's remarkable to watch. It's remarkable to hear the commentary. And I can't imagine what she feels like sitting there, because let's face it, I am not a woman of color.
Yeah.
And you and I talked about, right?
Yeah.
We talked about this when we serendipitously ran into each other. We had never met. Deepa and I never met before. I happened to be in Austin. She was in Austin. We happened to both be at the same conference. And I saw her name on the agenda as a speaker. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm meeting this woman next week on Zoom. So I went to her session and learned a lot. And the big, I really kind of agonized, and I shared this with Deepa. I agonized about taking on this role. Why am I, a white woman, interviewing a woman of color about the impact that the world has on them in positions of leadership and where we hope for them to go, right? The first, the few, the only. That's what we're here to talk about. And what I did was I contacted a handful of my girlfriends of color and I said, what should I do? I want to do this. I want to meet this woman. I love this book. I want to share it with every woman of color that I know, but why would I do this? Well, Fran, my girlfriends said back to me, you're an ally and we need co-conspirators and we need allies. And when I shared this with Deepa during her talk in Austin, she said, I don't want to, speak for you, Deepa,
Yeah.
but you told me something very interesting in your experience, in your experience of talking to people about the book. Let's, share that with our listeners, our attendees today.
Absolutely.
Please.
I've had to get to a new place. So the book only came out a few weeks ago, right? So we're 3 weeks in. So this is not a lifetime of data, but I wrote the book for women of color. I really toiled over who I was writing the book for and how I wanted to write the book. And part of what I wanted to do was to write a book for women of color, because we don't often get to tell our own stories. We don't often get to read things that are in our own voice. And so many of the business books out there are not written, frankly, by women. And definitely not by women of color. Only 11% of books written are written by women of color. And so it was really important for me to be able to write it, but to write to women of color. What's been fascinating 3 weeks in, and I did 3 sessions. This is my 4th session today, and all of they've all been the same. So this is a consistent, I won't call it challenge, but an interesting situation. How about that? I shared with Fran that everyone interviewing me predominantly has been a white man or a white woman, and that it's mostly ally and what I call co-conspirator. So instead of using the word ally, I like the word co-conspirator. I have taken it from Alicia Garza and I credit her in the book because I feel like it's a more active term. A lot of allyship is about bystanding. And I think we're in a moment where we need action, but it's been really interesting. In the first week of talking about the book, or maybe even 2 weeks before the book launch, I was really struggling because all the journalists talking to me were white men. They were telling me well, tell me the 3 things that I need to do around allyship and tell me what you want me to do. And that just wasn't what the book was about. And so I found myself pivoting a lot and taking the messages in the book and framing them for an allyship conversation. Now, I would say 5 weeks since that beginning conversation, I'm a little bit more humbled. I'm surprised in a good way who has shown up for the book. I'm surprised by how many people have read it already. I'm surprised at how many companies I'm being called to speak at. And the fact is, I think there's a desire to understand how the experience of women of color is different. And for allies to really, co-conspirators to really lean into helping. And so it's maybe not how I would have scripted it, but in some ways it's actually better because unfortunately for women of color, we don't sit in a lot of the seats of power, and to make change, it's going to take all of us working together. And I think we know that. And so it's a helpful conversation to have.
Absolutely. And I talk about that a lot myself, with regard to, women getting a seat at the table, all women getting a seat at the table, right? I always joke around that we have, we give birth to 100% of the population. So shouldn't we have a seat at the table when conversations are being had about us? So in the session that we did together, we met at in Austin, I loved the fact that there were white women in the audience asking you, what can we do to help? Okay, what does that mean? What does a co-conspirator mean? What's the difference between an ally and a co-conspirator? But how can we implement that? How can we actually take action and implement something that is going to have lasting impact?
Yeah, so I shared a couple of things with you, and I'll share them again here just for context setting. So one of the biggest things I want people to understand in reading the book is that a lot of workspaces, and although the book is about corporate America, I've now met with enough women that it's probably true, in all workspaces. I'm going to say a few things. So one is I wrote it for women of color. I'm finding a lot of white women, a lot of women in general, resonating with the themes in the book. So I do think there's an added level of complexity for women of color that we can talk about. But I think a lot of what I'm talking about is how work works for people. And I think we have seen that work is not working for most people right now, and especially for moms and especially for women. And there's enough data on the number of women that are leaving the workforce. So that's kind of been surprising. One of the things that the theme of the book is talking about is that corporate spaces or workspaces show up differently for different groups. And it's okay to talk about that. In the book, I call it the idea of the meritocracy. We have been taught, most of us, that corporate America in particular is a meritocracy, and that as long as you work hard, you will be okay. And if you work hard, you will all thrive and survive and rise in the same ways. And part of what that denies is the experience that for some of us, the actual day-to-day is different because of racism, because of discrimination, because of the challenges that we face at home and all the structural elements that we've never had space to talk about. And that's a very new conversation. In the book, I talk about an airplane analogy. So early on, I sat down with Renee Myers. She is a VP of inclusion at Netflix. She's a good friend of mine, and I wanted to interview her, for the book on inclusion. She does a lot of work in the space. She ended up jumping right to airplane design. And she said to me, Deepa, when I had young kids, I believe she has 2 kids. When they were young, I used to really worry when I traveled, like when there was turbulence on the airplane, I would worry about the luggage falling on my kid's head. I never understood why luggage was above our heads. Like, well, that whole process doesn't make sense to me as a mom. And as soon as she shared that, Fran, I jumped in and I said, I'm 5'1", so I'm little. I used to fly 3 cities a week. That was my job with Deloitte. And I always struggled with the overhead suitcase process. Like, I would worry about it a half an hour before I got on the plane. I just did 2 cities last week, same thing. I worry about it getting off the plane. I worry about it even before I'm in the actual, on the plane itself. And so I almost feel like I don't belong before I even enter the space. And as we were talking, I shared with her, like, isn't it so interesting? She's a taller Black woman, so she had never thought about the height issue. Here I am, I don't have children, but like the height issue is a real thing for me. And maybe the gentleman sitting next to me who's 5'10" or taller isn't even thinking about this. And I've shared this analogy enough to know when I share it, a lot of men will say to me, like, I've never thought about that. Like, it never even occurred to me. And it's a great example of how spaces can show up different for different people, and that we've never really talked about that. And part of why the airplane that happens to us is because in the 70s, when that cargo space was designed, there were only 2 or 3% of women who were part of the design team. So we weren't even in those conversations. So our needs were not met. And it's similar in the workplace. I think we were not, well, I know we were not in the seats when the system was designed. It's still designed for a 2-parent household where one usually would stay at home, they're usually the woman, and the husband would go off to work. And the entire model is based on that. It's never been updated. And so as a result of that, I don't think it actually reflects some of the challenges that show up differently for different groups. And it doesn't really talk about that. What's been interesting in talking about the book is that white men are also saying, like, it doesn't work for me anymore either. I want to be home to raise my children. I want more flexibility. I don't want to be killing myself to make work, work make work fit into my life. I want my life to be central. And so I think we're in a moment after the last couple of years where there's a lot of questioning going on, where there's a lot of space to talk about how work can change. And that's really what this book is about. And so that's why I think it's a little bit of a broader conversation, even though I am really trying to give voice to the ways in which the actual day-to-day experience, lived experience of women of color is different. Because the other part of this is, Fran, until 2 years ago, I don't think there was even permission to talk about the fact that workspaces showed up differently for us. I think it's only been since George Floyd's murder, and we've talked about the potential of racism at work, that we can even have that discussion. I can't tell you how many of the women of color I interviewed were told it doesn't happen at work. And so for a long time, I think we've been gaslit, believing some of what we're experiencing isn't happening to us. And as a result, it has all these implications for us. So I think there's a lot there in that question, but I think that's really what I'm trying to get at, and why I think this book is important for a lot of people to understand the conversation.
I agree with you. I think that, for me, again, as a white woman, I just always thought, well, all women had to work twice as hard to be half as good, right? Which is, but as I have these, girlfriends of color who are superstars in their work, and we had these really real conversations around George Floyd. Yeah. And I learned so much more about how much harder it is. And you talk about that a lot in the book. Yeah. Right. And I understand it's a much broader conversation. One of the things that I find challenging is that, how corporate America is addressing this prior to George Floyd, since George Floyd, right? Like you said, we haven't even really had a safe space until George Floyd. Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about how microaggressions might get addressed in the workplace. I'm really curious about that, because I have a bias about DEI departments, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I'd like to hear your take on the microaggressions. Yeah. So I think, because I did this work, like this question came up quite a bit. I ended up charting out like what is really different for women of color. And I ended up with a list of about a dozen items that I do think are fundamentally different for women than women of color. I won't go through all of them, but I'll give you one or two examples because I think it's important just for context setting. I think one of the differences that I found with a lot of women of color is the amount of racism or microaggressions or stereotypes that they are fighting on a constant basis. And I think, Fran, I may even have shared this story with you. One of the women I interviewed in the Midwest, she works in a large consumer products company. She's a Black woman. She said, I knew when I joined my company, I was the only Black woman in the department. She said, I came to find out within 6 months, I was the only one in my entire company. And as we got through the interview, towards the end of the interview, maybe 20 minutes left, she started crying pretty strong, like pretty heavy tears. And she said, I feel really responsible for representing all Black people to the employees in my entire company. And she said, I've never really thought about it, but as you're asking me these questions, Deepa, I think I'm probably one of the only Black people in the entire town or city that the company is based in. And so I feel a very strong responsibility for making sure people have a good impression of all Black people. She's an accountant. I think I shared with you, right? She's an accountant. That has nothing to do with the job she was hired to do. And she was sharing with me the list of things she does as a result of feeling that. Like she changes her hair, she changes what she wears, she changes what she eats and what she talks about. She really is careful in curating like how much she presents. And how she presents herself as a result of wanting to be perfect, representing all Black people. But think about that. Like that's not anything she was hired to do, as an example. And in some ways, what that is also getting at is how she is maybe fighting stereotypes and actually internalize those stereotypes and is doing active work to change them, right? So as an example, another is just the stress, exactly, the stress. Another is just the extra jobs that a lot of women of color take on, whether those are culture building in informal ways or whether those are formal DE&I roles that we can talk about. So again, there's about 12 or 14 items in the book that are clearly laid out that are these extra things. There's also a difference, I think, in how we were raised for a lot of us, right? So I think being a woman of color, you navigate these spaces where you don't feel seen and heard. As a little girl, I never saw myself on television or my teachers, and I was never represented. And when you walk around never
feeling seen, it really does something to you on, ideas of if you're enough and if you're good enough and, what that means for your identity. I think a lot of women face that, but it's almost extra layers when you have literally never seen yourself on a magazine or on television. And a lot of what you talk about is really denied, right? There wasn't a lot of benefit. My parents were immigrants to this country. We did not talk about race growing up. I didn't really understand what I was navigating. And yet, there was always this element because I was one of maybe 4 or 5 students of color in my entire 400 or 500 person school. And so there was always a difference of what language we spoke at home and what we ate at home. And so there's layer and complexity that you don't really understand. So I think those are all real things. On the microaggression front, what I find is a lot of women of color get caught flat-footed. And so I want to state, like, microaggressions, I think, are maybe small things that are said, maybe not meant to be hurtful, but they actually affect the person in a really difficult way. I think racism is part of that spectrum. And so a lot of where we are now is people will say microaggressive elements are actually racism. And so I just want to be clear. I think there's a spectrum with some things that might feel minor to the person saying it, but it might land very different for the person who's receiving it. But a lot of what happens in those situations is women of color just feel confused. And I'm sure it's true for women as well. Someone will say something, right? And I think we're all caught off guard. Like, did that just really get said? Did that really just happen? But there's something when it comes to race that I think makes women of color in particular feel shame and pain in those moments. So that you feel almost like, what did I do to create that? What did I do to solicit that? Like, what am I doing that allowed that person to say that to me in a work context? And I cannot tell you how many times that kept coming up, story after story after story. And so part of what I'm asking women of color to do, and then I'll get to the allies, is I'm asking women of color be prepared. Like, I want us to know that we are going to face microaggressions and racism in the workplace. It may not be intentional. It may not be, coming from a bad place, but it is absolutely going to happen. So when someone makes a comment, have things practiced so that you know what to do. Have a philosophy. So for me, I've gotten smarter as I've gotten older. And now I know, like, I'm going to wait 10 minutes. If someone says something, I'm just going to call it stupid. I'm going to wait 10 minutes. And if I'm still upset, then I'm going to say something because it's too much energy to speak every time someone says something that bothers me, right? But I know in 10 minutes, if I don't say something, I'm probably not going to let it go. And I have things practiced. So I know if someone says something that is going to offend me, I will say something like, we need to unpack what was just said. I need to pause because I need 5 minutes to talk about what was just said, or what was just said really, I don't think landed how you meant it to be. We need to talk about that. Whatever that looks like for you. What I'm realizing is allies and co-conspirators, you also have never been taught what to do about racism. Many of us have never grown up talking about race at our, in our homes. With the women I interviewed, there was a small section of Black women who had talked about race at home, but a lot of the other women had never talked about race at home. So we're all caught off guard. And so we don't know what to do. We don't know what to say. And so for co-conspirators and allies, I think it's also important. You're going to be in moments where you see something or something is said that doesn't sit right with you. And it's okay for you to say, what was just said, feels strange. Something was just said. Can we revisit that? Or at the end of this meeting, I'd love to come back to what was just said and make sure everyone is okay. Like, that can be your work too. But in the same way that I'm saying women of color have to practice so that we don't get out of our power, out of alignment in that moment where we feel pain and shame, I think co-conspirators have to do the same thing because we just have never practiced that. And it doesn't have to be these moments that are painful and difficult. These are just intervention points that we're too worried about saying the wrong thing or being nice or whatever that is, that we don't often just say enough to actually unpack a moment and just clarify points.
I love that idea of being prepared, but at the same time, it seems like we're putting more work on ourselves. I've got to prepare to respond to a racist comment or a microaggression.
Yes.
But as I sit here and think about it, I can remember being a young woman working on Wall Street with all the construction guys lined up outside Wall Street, and you'd walk down the street and they'd all have something to say. And I remember my dad making me practice to respond to them because you were so angry, the sexist comments that they were making. So part of me is feeling like, why do we have to do that? But on the other hand, I hear what you're saying and why it's important. And I love the idea of pausing to think about it. I usually don't do that. I usually just go right for it, right? So pausing is a good idea. Taking a deep breath, practicing some yoga breaths, maybe that's a good idea. Let's go back to how that gets addressed in the workplace, because I know that we have all these affinity groups now, right? All these corporations have all these affinity groups. I think I shared this with you when we met last week. majority of the people running those affinity groups are people of color.
Mhm.
So for me, it's, I'm on the outside looking in, again, a white woman looking in, I'm saying, okay, is that just a box you're checking?
Yeah.
Or what are really the resources that that department or that affinity group really has? In addition to what they're charged with doing, right? What kind of resources are those department heads really, what do they really have access to? And what I have found, because oftentimes I'm asked to speak to those groups, what I have found is that there's no budget.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, why are we doing this? Are we checking a box, or are we really giving people the resources that they need to effect change? If you're putting a Black woman or a woman of color or a man of color into a DEI role, and there's no spend against that, what are we really saying about how we feel about the initiative on its own merit? So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging situation. I believe we're still on the early stage of getting it right in a lot of workplaces, right? It has taken us decades, if not centuries, to get here, and I think it's going to take us a long time to get out. So this idea that one person's going to come in, or maybe even 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 are going to come in and fix, a long history, I think is erroneous. I get calls from a lot of women of color because of the company that we have founded, who have been in roles for maybe, let's say, 6 months. And they're calling me because they were promised all of these things. They were promised, a title, direct reporting to the CEO, a sizable budget, staff, and they're 6 months into the role, maybe even 3 months in the role, and they got none of those things. So I think in some companies, it does feel like what I call, propaganda. One of the white male leaders I interviewed said that he feels like in a lot of companies, it is propaganda, or what I call performative. I think that's true. I think there are some companies that are trying to get it right, but I do think that those groups are under-resourced. I think there's a challenge that I found that makes this even more complicated, because a lot of the women of color I interviewed want to do this work. At the same time, because they feel responsible, they feel like it's part of their calling. It is so part of like why they are in the roles that they're in, even if that's not what they were hired to do. At the same time, they're overburdened. There's so much being asked of these few, first fews and onlys. I think I may have shared with you when I was giving my speech that one of the metrics that I found really challenging was the amount of mentoring some of these women do. So when you tend to be an only, I think most women, in these companies end up mentoring more than the men, right? Just because there's fewer women. Now think of it, but from a woman of color, and especially like a Black woman standpoint, there's even less. And so some of the women I interviewed, they were literally mentoring 200 to 300, in one case, 500 people. And I don't mean like in an informal way. Some of the women I met literally kept their entire Friday afternoons free, 4 hours for just office hours every single week. And so these extra burdens are real. And the amount of culture building that we're asking women of color to do is real. And in a lot of cases, you're right, it's not compensated. We've started to find that a few companies are compensating for their ERG roles. It's like the first time it made big news in the last couple of months. I want to see more companies do it. But I also think that we're in a place where we're still understanding how much needs to change. The idea that an inclusion group or a few people can change a company, I think is flawed. Like what we're really talking about is culture change, and it takes everybody at all levels. And it's going to take us some time to even understand what the work is to make companies and cultures, get rid of their bias and get rid of, some of the challenges that they have. This is hard, and it's not going to be, drop a woman or two in a seat and it's all going to get taken care of. It's not that kind of work.
Agreed. Let's go back for a moment and just talk about what we talked about when we met each other. Sorry, we keep referring to that, but it was just such serendipity. When we were talking about what are the things that women can do, that women like me can do to support our friends, our colleagues, because we're talking about change inside the corporation, right? And we're thinking about it having to come from the top down, but what about having it come from the bottom up?
Yeah.
And what about getting people together who are going to impact and affect change for their friends, their colleagues of color? What role can women inside of corporations take on to help impact that change from the bottom up?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that question as well. So let's see, I'm going to come at it 2 ways. So one is when I was doing the research for the book, there were two things, and I literally say this is the most shocking thing, and here's the second most shocking thing. And the first most shocking thing I found in the research is how many women of color were ill, right? So the burden in navigating these spaces, the stress of all eyes on them. You and I were talking right before the call started. I'm curious with Judge Brown, right? Like beyond the scope of the job that she's being hired to do, all the extra pressure, all eyes on her, like how is she going to handle that? That's a really big burden that we don't talk about enough. And it was true for a lot of the women I talked about. So sickness was the first thing. The second most shocking thing was at the end of the interviews, I'd say to the women, is there anything else you want to share with me? Anything I didn't ask you? And they would drop their eyes. They would kind of look down. If I was meeting them in person, they would look at their shoes. If it was on Zoom, you could just see them dart their eyes down and they'd say, I want you to talk about how women don't help each other. And they would say, I want you to talk about how in a lot of cases, white women have been our biggest obstacles, but even as women of color, we don't help each other, whether that's Black women to Black women or Indian women to Black women, like even within those cohorts. And I think a lot of it has to do with the idea, two things. One is that I think so many of us are just pressed with rising. There's so much pressure, even as a woman, with all eyes on you and expectations and having to be 2 or 4 times as good, that I think it's hard to kind of pick your head up sometimes and just give more help. It's difficult, right? Because you're just trying to keep to what you have. I think the second thing is, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book, is I think there's things that we've been taught growing up. I think there's things we've been taught about the system that are just flawed and not things that I think we should believe anymore. So the idea that there's one seat, that there's 12 seats maybe at an executive table and that there's one seat for a woman, maybe a seat for a woman of color, or maybe half a seat. We call it a broken chair in information. But the idea that there is one seat is a really challenging idea. And you'll hear it over and over again. Fran, like this company, like the next person that's going to get promoted is a woman, as if there's a designated seat. And that idea that there's one seat suggests that the other 11 are not available to you and I. And as a result, I think there is inherent and unconscious competition in ways that there shouldn't be. And so I think it's bred into, some of what we believe when we buy into these models and we step into these companies. And so I think that's another part of it. We did research with Billie Jean King, Information, my company, with Billie Jean King in the fall. And one of the things that we found in the research is that 91% so we interviewed 1,700 women, mostly women of color, but a number of white women. We did it in interviews, and then we also did it in a survey. Of the white women that we spoke to, 91% said they wanted to mentor or sponsor a woman of color. So really high number. But what we found is only 9% were actually mentoring or sponsoring. And so there's a real, I think, gap between wanting to help and actually doing the work to help. And I don't think it's coming from any bad place of like, I don't care. I think it just comes back to we're busy. The last couple of years have been hard. Like there's just so much going on. And we also don't even know how we stay in the roles that we're in. And so as a result, if there is any extra bandwidth, it's not necessarily going to help our sisters in a way that it could. And so I think that data was really shocking to me. The fact that so many women of color felt like white men were helpful, but white women sometimes were not, was shocking. I mean, it was over and over and over again. And I think we have to talk about it because I think we can change it. There's a couple of examples in the book where I met with women of color who were talking about that sense of competition. And one example is a woman who worked in a large beverage company. She was, I'm going to pick a number. I think she was number 12 to be hired into the VP level. And the next level was the C-suite. And so before she was into that level, there was a feeling of these 11 women are the chosen ones. One of them is going to move to the C-suite. As soon as she got her promotion, became the 12th, she felt like she literally had a target on her back. There was a lot of gossip. There was a lot of discussion. She all like felt excluded from events. And I said to her, why can't you take the other 11 women out to dinner and just have a conversation about how you want to do it differently? Like, isn't there a different way that you don't feel like you're competing, where you're not feeling like you have to be awful to one another? It took her 3 months and they finally went out and they had the conversation. And just by having the conversation, were able to break down some of that barrier. They weren't even aware they were doing it, right? And so I think some of this is the setup and really unpacking the setup. In the book, I talk about a concept called the power of me and the power of we. So the power of me is the work that we have to do, whether that you're a white woman, whether you're a woman of color, whether you're whoever you are. There is work that we have to do to let go of messages we've been told that are not helpful to us, this indoctrination that happens around us, what we've been told about systems and structures. That is me work. And you do that by figuring out what matters to you. A lot of the women of color I met rewrite what's important to them when they get into big life events. So they've gotten through a divorce, or something happens in their life where they've gotten sick, or something happens really racist at work, and they realize that the system doesn't actually work in the way that they were taught, and they have to maybe rethink what they believe. So that's like the me work, and that's hard work, but that's kind of the first step. But once you do the me work, in order to actually change structures, you need the power of we, which is what you're talking about. It's coming together, whether that's as women of color, whether that's as women overall, whether that's us and working with men who sit in a lot of these power seats. We all have to work together to make change. And so I think you need both parts of this equation if we're truly going to make change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, we started our conversation kind of talking about that. Have a little anecdotal story. I remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg was interviewed once, and I believe I'm paraphrasing, but I believe the interviewer said, could you ever imagine a Supreme Court of all women? And she said, well, why would that be so difficult to believe? We've had a Supreme Court of all men and all white men, right?
Yes.
So I love what you're talking about in the book about breaking down these conscripts, or these structures, and the fact that we've all subscribed to them, right?
Exactly.
I love the idea of, why are there only 11 seats?
Right.
And why do we have to give one seat to this color and one seat to that gender? And it's a fascinating way to think about it. And, there's so much going on right now that I really do feel, and I know you think so too, because we've talked about it, this is such a time for women of color, more women of color are the fastest growing segment in the workforce of the United States. And by the way, it's the fastest growing segment of small business owners are women of color. So it is a fascinating time, and it's fascinating to be a part of it and watch it happen. And I'm grateful to you for bringing it to the forefront. So one of the things we talked about was how your health was impacted. And I wanted to ask you, was your health the final factor? You've been feeling all of this, right? In your work life, even in your role at Deloitte, you were the first, right? And then your health became an issue. And I believe that it was shortly thereafter when you decided to part ways. Tell us about that experience, how you came to that decision. And you mentioned earlier about, the health of women. Yeah. And particularly women of color.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation. So again, this is like a space where I think the book really speaks to a lot of people in this moment in a way that I never expected, because I think everyone is really asking themselves questions about how much space do I want work to take up in my life? And many of us have been taught that we live to work, right? Like we accommodate everything around work. And I think we're in a moment where we're saying, like, does that even make sense for us as Americans anymore? Like, is that really what we want our life to look like? And so it's a really important moment. I think for me previously, I used to think that health and success were two different things, right? That I could be successful and rise and get all the things and all the accolades and, the money and all the things that come with external, metrics that people kind of give you of what's important. But I could have that without my health. I would sacrifice my health, right? Like I mentioned a few times, I, did 3 cities a week. I didn't always take care of myself. There was something about, we used to get training of being an elite athlete. Like there was something about like how I could overperform that was really part of the culture that I was in. And I think it's culture that is in almost all companies in corporate America. And I think it actually asks you to sacrifice your health sometimes for success. And I think we're in a moment where I think that is being divorced or that is being separate. My own story is that I had growing questions around purpose. I did not go to, early on, we did the bio. I didn't go to business school, right? So I never thought I was going to be in the private sector for 21 years. I ended up there for 21 years. I thought I was just going for a year or two. So my background had actually been policy and politics. I wanted to do a year or two of private sector and then get out and go back to, politics. But I was young at that time. And the idea of what I had to do to kind of climb felt much slower in the political policy realm than it did in the private sector. But I did well. And so I stayed much longer than I ever expected. I probably knew I wanted to leave for about 3 years. So the growing question around purpose, am I doing the right things? The election of the last few elections, I think really asked me questions about, am I living my life's purpose? Where did I start? How did I get here? Just big questions I think a lot of women were asking themselves. And then I started to get sick. I kept getting progressively sick. In the book, I talk about these things called mysterious illnesses. So I mentioned that 2 out of 3 women I interviewed were sick. I had a lot of those symptoms. So skin rashes, hives, stomach aches, migraines, headaches, heart palpitations, adrenal fatigue, fertility issues. There's like a list of things in the book that almost every woman of color had. And I had a lot of those things, but I had other things and they were growing. I tell a story in the book where I was at my 14th doctor. And, she was a doctor I saw when I traveled. So I literally had my suitcase with me. And, I tell a story in the book where she's kind of looking at me funny. She's like, why are you at the doctor's office with your suitcase? Like that in itself speaks to your challenge. But she looks at me and she says, we've run 3 sets of tests, like hundreds of tests, and there is definitely something wrong with you, but we can't find the smoking gun. We can keep doing tests, or I can tell you what you probably already know. I think your job is killing you. And then she said, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. What would you do if you didn't do this job? Do you feel like you have to have a big job like this to be important or feel worthy? And can't you see that you're just worthy being you? And I remember being just stunned in that moment because she had seen through me. And I think part of my challenge and part of the challenge I have found for a lot of high performing women, and especially women of color, is that you give so much to rise to roles like that. There's so much you sacrifice because there's so many eyes on you. And there's such a sense of being perfect and overperforming and overworking, all the things you said, Fran, just because there's so many eyes on us. And so part of it is that you get there and you just realize like, it's my entire identity. And so for me, it was a little bit of like, what else am I going to be if I'm not this job? And so the last few years have been that process of unpacking that. Writing this book was a little bit of that. It was kind of figuring out like, how did I get to where I got? Because I wasn't really healthy or maybe even successful in my new definition of what that looks like. And so for me, it was probably a combination of a few things, but I left right before the Great Resignation was termed the Great Resignation. I left very early in COVID. There were a lot of people who thought I was losing, my marbles to leave at that time because I was giving up stability in a moment where we had such uncertainty. But it also felt really important that if I didn't get out, I didn't know when I would, because my biggest challenge was I felt responsible. So as a first, I think a lot of us feel responsible for staying in the seat. So I said I stayed 3 years longer than I should. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that being a first, I didn't want to fail, not only myself, but I didn't want to fail the people coming after me. And I didn't want there to be any discussion of like, she couldn't hack it or, it's too hard or whatever that is. And so I think I stayed in the seat until I realized I started meeting with women of color. It started one-on-one over time that turned into about a dozen dinners across the country where I met over 300 women of color. And I saw patterns in what I was experiencing. And a lot of them felt that responsibility too. So meeting them, seeing these patterns that I'm talking about in the book helped me realize like, I don't have to stay, like that's maybe not my work anymore, and freed me to go make different choices.
That's really wonderful and just very inspiring to that you had the space to do that. You had the foresight, you had the vision. And I think timing is everything. You're seizing this moment by opening up this conversation and having this conversation. So that's a nice segue into any questions from our attendees. Please put your questions in the chat. I'm happy to share them with Deepa. The team at the Westport Library will make sure we see them. So please go ahead if you have any questions. It'd be great. So on that note, while we're waiting for hopefully some questions to come through, share with me a little bit about, your advice that you would give to young women, right? There are so many young women of color out there, and I speak to them. I speak to young women often just because of my work in general. And I feel as though, again, I'm overstating what you've already said, that we're at a turning point. We're at an inflection point. What would you say to these young women who are entering the workforce about what they can expect and how they can be part of the change that we're all hoping to see?
Yeah, so I did speak to women at all levels. I did skew a little bit more senior because I wanted to see what happened when women got to the top. Unfortunately, what I found from a lot of them was that they believed erroneously that once they got to the top, they would be able to do it their way. There was this idea of like, I'll sacrifice, I'll mute myself, I'll erase parts of myself, I'll conform. And then once I get to maybe the VP level or higher, then I can do me. Unfortunately, a lot of what I found was that there was actually less ability to do you, as women put it, once you get to that level, because you have conformed for so long. So a lot of my message to women of color and younger women, I think they're smarter in that they seem to understand that the workplace will request them to do this. A lot of them said they had no expectation of being in the workplace for more than a year or two. They all wanted to go start their own businesses. So I think they're even going in mentality is different. But I also think they underestimate the pressure when they're there. So I did speak with a few young women who are struggling with, I don't want to call them smaller things, but they're the same issue, just in smaller form or fashion. One of the women of color told me she really struggles with, like, she wants to wear red lipstick, for example, but on Zoom calls, will that be seen as professional? And she said, I really agonize over how I present myself on these calls because I've never even met some of my team and this is my first job. And all of these things that are really fascinating in this moment that we're in. So I think they're real. My advice to women, and I think this is true for all women, is I don't think we sometimes understand the ways in which we edit ourselves or that we adapt with the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so this work really is about agency. It's about understanding that if you are not thoughtful in the ways that you compromise, if you are not really structured on the boundaries that you set and the things that are important to you, the system will continue to ask you to do things, and you will end up in this role where you may be in a powerful role, but not really feeling powerful. And that's really what this book is about. And so I think it's really this discussion of, you can have agency on small decisions. You have to pick and choose your battles. I'm not asking women to be their full selves all the time, because I don't think that's helpful, but it's really being thoughtful about what are the things you're not willing to compromise on? What are the things that are so important to you? And how do you bring those things to work? And how do you set those boundaries? I think it's also a little bit of a question about power. You know, as you get into the later parts of the book, I met with a lot of women of color and a lot of women, and they struggle with the term power. Like, most of us have been taught that power is a bad thing, that power is used for evil, that power is top down, all of these ideas. And part of what I'm seeing is a movement from women and women of color to want to redefine power in a different way, that we believe it can be used for good, that we believe it can be a multiplier, that we believe there's new ways to work and new ways to be, but the old constructs don't work for us anymore. And that we want to kind of see positive change, but it might not look like it has looked before. And that's really what we're talking about. It's about agency to step into some of that.
That's just so interesting the way you describe that, because I have a friend who is a very successful state senator in Connecticut, and she is a woman of color. And I've always thought of her as very powerful. Mm. And when and she's intimidating. She's my girlfriend for years and years, but she's very intimidating. And when I said to her that, you're so powerful, she's like, powerful? No, I'm not. I'm not powerful. No, but you are powerful. And we've had that conversation many, many times. And she's always kind of, ducking behind the scenes, like not wanting. She's a very tall woman. She has presence, and so she always wanted to be like a behind the scenes person. And one day she said to me, the only reason I'm out in front is because you made me get there. Mm-hmm. And I said, I made you get there. You've been mentoring me, because and maybe I put this pressure on her, right? Because I would say to her, you have an obligation to all these young Black women. You are a woman in position of leadership in our state. You need to pave the way for others. And she was like, I do. Yes, you do. So now, after this conversation, actually, Deepa, I'm wondering, did I put pressure on her to do that? And she has stepped into that. She stepped into that space because she is a trailblazer. She does have this, I feel, we all do. It doesn't matter white, Black, brown, doesn't matter. We all have, as women, the obligation to bring others along, because, and I know that you have an opinion about, if you can see it, you can be it, right? Yeah. So I really feel like if people can see that this woman, little girls can see that, they have something to aspire to. So talk to me a little bit about that, because I know that you have a different take on that. If you can see it, you can be it.
Yeah, so one is I had shared, and in the book, there's a line that says, you don't have to see it to be it. And part of why I convinced myself that is because I didn't necessarily see it. And so, yes, I think it's always helpful to have representation. I think representation innately creates a sense of belonging. But when you don't have it, I literally never had it growing up. Indra Nooyi is probably the most, the best example that I have. And that's only in the last, few years. It's not something that I had growing up. There was literally nothing. And so part of what you have to do in those situations, I think, is kind of create a new narrative for yourself. And so I kept an email draft in my inbox that said, you don't have to see it to be it, to remind myself I didn't need that. But I think with your friend, it's a really interesting dilemma. So part of what I think happens with a lot of us is ingrained in who we are. And I talk about this in chapter 2, these messages that we got growing up, ingrained in who we are as women, and especially women of color, the sense of community, the sense that the responsibility is larger than us, was literally throughout every single woman I talked to, in a very different way than when I talked to men, in a very different way than I talked to certain white women. So I think there is something that feels different, in that there was so much sacrifice for us to get here, whether it was our parents coming to this country or our history of enslavement in this country. There's like so much more that we're carrying that I think really feels weighty. There's a chapter in the book that is called The Job and the Job. So all these extra roles and responsibilities women of color take on. And one of the stories I say is that there's 5 archetypes that I found for women of color and how they navigate workspaces. And I talk about how I was at lunch one time with a woman of color, and she said, I am not worried about bringing up others behind me. I'm just getting to the table. I think I called her a seat sower. My job is just to sow the seeds. I am the one getting to the table, and then everyone else is everyone else's work. And I literally dropped my fork as we were at lunch, because I never heard a woman of color say that before. And she just kind of unpacked for me. She's like, I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I have 3 kids at home. I'm responsible for all these church activities. Like, I can't do anymore. I am just trying to keep my own lights on. I cannot take responsibility for everyone else. And so I share that example because I think it's a real dilemma. I think a lot of us feel that pressure and that sense of responsibility, and I think it's real. At the same time, I think there are some women who they just can't take that on. And so I think it's up to your friend to know if that's something she wants to take on. And my work is really showing women you have a choice in that. And so that it feels joyful versus a burden. I think that's a little bit of reframing, but also being thoughtful. For some women, their job isn't their whole identity, and they want to spend as little time as they can and go do other things. And I think that's okay too, but we all get to make those choices.
Oh, very good point. So I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A box. So I have one.
Okay.
How did you feel when Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee for vice president?
I mean, elated, right? I never in my lifetime, similar to today, right? Never in my lifetime did I ever expect that. I think especially given her Indian roots, like the immigrant aspect was also really different. I think it's an aspect of the book, that I just want to bring back to, because I don't think we talk about it enough. I think that, when you grow up in this country and you come from another country, right? So my parents came from India. I was born here, raised here, but there was a sense of like, we're not even part of the dialogue. In this country, there's Black and there's white. And I think the rest of us, at least growing up, I felt like I didn't exist in a lot of ways. And so to see her and to see pictures of her with her mom and a sari, or to be talking about her relatives in India, I think there's a lot to that to unpack. The fact that someone is sitting in a seat of power and there's more to her story, I think was really fascinating. I think for a lot of little Black and brown girls, just like today, it's redefining what power looks like and what's possible in ways that I don't think we can even get our head around. Like, for so many decades, we haven't seen ourselves. So I think it's completely revolutionary in ways we can't even understand. But I feel like today is a little bit different, just to make a comparison, because I sometimes worry, and I've never really said this out loud, but I worry with Vice President Harris, like, is she really able to step into her full power? Is she really able to do everything she needs to do? Because she's kind of, vying for potentially maybe the next job, whereas maybe, Judge Brown will not have that responsibility because it's a lifetime seat. I'm hopeful so that maybe we'll see a different kind of power potentially, but it's a really interesting dilemma, is like these women who there's so many eyes on them, like how do they stay true to who they are, and how do they find their power and do what makes them happy while they're also carrying this weight that is real?
Such an interesting perspective. And we're going to wrap up, but I have some words from Carla Harris. I don't know if you follow Carla, but
yeah, I do.
Yeah, I love her. She's amazing. And I've known Carla for a long time, and something that she has always said, and this is my closing message to our guests, and I think you'd agree with it. If you were invited to the table, you belong at the table. If you were invited into the room, you belong in that room and own your power.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you. I mean, that was a great comment to end on this evening. I want to thank both Deepa and Fran for having this incredible conversation. From my own perspective, I've learned so much tonight. I want to go out and conquer the world and bring along women of color with me. So this has been great. And I want to thank everyone who joined us, because this was a special privilege tonight on this special day in our country's history. So thank you both. And
Thank you.
Luck. All right.
Deepa, thank you so much. And I want to just share one last comment about the book. I really urge everyone to get the book. You won't be sorry. It's only been out for a couple of weeks. You can get it, am I right? You can get it on Amazon, Deepa?
You can get it everywhere. Yes.
Thank you so much, Deepa. It
Thank
was
you.
so fun to meet you and to
Thank
do this
you.
with you. And we'll be in
Yes.
touch.
Yeah, and
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you for hosting this event to both of the libraries. And also, Fran, thank you for having the conversation. You opened with it, you weren't sure you should, but I think it was a magical conversation. So I'm glad you did. So thank you.
Yes.
Good, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week.